That's some pretty amazing stuff that Kvetkovic and those people have been doing in Belgrade since 1975 or so. It's the I I've only ever worked with linear algebra and automata at the level at the level of Markov processes, and there are certain conditions on Markov processes that keep the solutions much simpler than the general case that Kvetkovic has dealt with. When I studied Richard Gibbon's course, because it's the same course in which he taught, the one I was talking about was called Continuous Mathematics, and it covered Markov chains and what were called, it was a whole series of probability results. It was basically different notions of limits of probability, like and stuff like Kolmogorov's theorem and to do with different notions of probability and convergence. And these notions come into the analysis of Markov processes. But Richard hadn't, in Richard's course there wasn't a clear connection between those processes and linear algebra. Except because by taking only Markov processes you kind of trivialize the decomposition of the transition matrices and things, because they always come out as a single eigenvalue, I think. So when I get to eutactic stars and things, my eyes cross. But I think it would be very interesting to look at John H. Conway's 1966 treatment of finite automata, which was the subject of Peter Sewell's PhD. So Peter's an expert in all this. And I've never read that book. It's as old as me. I never seen a copy of it. But that matrix approach to finite automata was the subject of Ken Moody's Part 2 Computer Science Tripos, or Part 1A, or I can't remember what they called it all, course. And once a student came and kind of at the last hour said he wanted a supervision on that course, so I printed it off and took it home and studied it for an evening, and I think the next day I gave him a very rough and ready supervision. But that whole way of doing that was also a decomposition and blocking procedure. It was very interesting. Ken's course was quite good. I did quite a lot of work with Nicholas Cutler and the librarian who typed it all out into tech, and I proofread it. And then Ken kind of backed off when he didn't want to engage in. No, he wasn't like Glyn. He didn't want to explain stuff. He just wiped it out. There was a whole layer of proof between treating regular expressions and matrices of regular expressions that Ken had left out. And I said to him, look, you've left out all this. You've got to prove all these things. You can't just say that because this operation commutes, that the matrix commutes. You've actually got to prove that. I don't know, maybe it was that Ken had just followed Conway's book, and that Conway had done the same thing. It works out in the end, I think, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe there was a big secret buried in there or something. I don't know, but nobody fucking talked to me, and I never seen a copy of the book, so. But in general, the intuition behind those eigenvalues and angles in Kvetkovich treatment, if you think of any graph as you imagine that you're walking around a graph following the edges from node to node. At any node you can take paths. That treatment they're not directed graphs. So at any node you could take a path to any of the other nodes to which there's an edge leads. So a vector of nodes, all the nodes in the graph, is operated on by just multiplying the adjacency matrix by the vector and iterating that composition. And what you imagine is that you've got a superposition of places you could be on the graph as a probability distribution, and that probability distribution then evolves. And in Markov processes, the transition matrices, the edge probabilities or the weights, the edges of a Markov process are weighted by a normal probability distribution out of each state. But in this case, it's a simpler, I'm guessing the orthonormal basis is to do with simply saying that we're talking about uniform distributions. And it's a useful, I thought about these things for a while when I was trying to synthesize probability distributions from uniform distributions. For example, if all you've got is a coin tosser and you want to generate a 1/3 probability, you can do that by having three states in a loop, and at each state you are taking a coin toss to decide which way round the loop to go. So you're doing a random walk around the loop, and it starts out a bit rough, but the eigenvector of that distribution is just 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So in the limit, you're using a coin toss to generate a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 distribution. And by prime factorization or something like that, you can generate any uniform probability distribution from just a coin toss. And my idea was to kind of decompose I guess PDFs, probability distribution functions, into basic binary choices. So somewhere in some of that crazy, I think it's in the unexpurgated long version of my guerrilla logic. I was thinking about products of graphs. When you have these graphs evolving independently, and then you consider the distribution of the product. But it's really interesting, and so that this way of kind of doing maths, keeping it up in the air and just talking about it, I reckon it works. I wouldn't mind seeing some replies from videos like this made by Peter Sewell and, well, Richard Gibbons, John Conway. They're not going to be able to take part, but maybe there are lectures by them that we can look at. I wouldn't mind just being able to find Richard Gibbons' lecture notes. When I looked on the lab page, I couldn't even recognize Richard Gibbons' course. I felt like I'd woken up in another parallel universe where he'd never done that. It makes me paranoid. Bisimulation is another interesting thing. I wouldn't mind being able to find the Glyn put lots of bisimulation exercises and things into his course, but they never made it onto the official published version on the web. But the actual course notes handed out to students at different years got pretty complicated. Almost every year I used to have to go. He wouldn't keep the exercise numbers the same, so almost every year I had to go through my student notes and where he added new exercise, and I had to go renumber all the solutions and add solutions to these new questions, and then I don't know, so there's some kind of divergence going on there. Apparently my home directory at the lab is still on the backups, so I didn't copy that directory, but I had all my notes for my students were in a subdirectory that's at the lab. I handed them all over to Larry Paulson when I left, and he said something like, "Oh, you haven't given this. Where's this macro? Where are these tech macros or something?" I don't know what his problem was, but I don't have enough space on my phone to download that stuff, so I can't do it. I saw a guy yesterday with a Gateway netbook of the kind that you can buy at Walmart, Mexico, for 5,000 pesos, and I was very jealous. Mind you, it only has a 64 gigabyte hard drive, but maybe if you didn't have Windows on it, you wouldn't use up so much of that. That's it. This works well. Keep talking.